Let me take you back to a New York City where the air was thick with cigarette smoke, taxi horns, and the constant hum of a city that never slept, even though, in those days, it sometimes stumbled. The Great Depression had sunk its claws into every borough. Bread lines wrapped around blocks, crime simmered in the shadows, and corruption was just another line item in the city's budget. And into this world walked a man barely 5 feet tall, carrying a grit and fire more powerful than any skyscraper around him. His name was Fiorello Henry LaGuardia, and he would become one of the most remarkable mayors in American history. But before the world knew him as the Little Flower, long before he read comics over the radio or battled Tammany Hall, Fiorello was simply a kid growing up in a life that rarely stood still. He was born on December 11, 1882, in Greenwich Village, the son of Italian and Jewish immigrants, a combination that would later help him speak to people across the cultural and ethnic mosaic of New York. His father was a musician in the U.S. Army, which meant the family moved often. Fiorello grew up hearing military music, immigrant stories, and the harsh realities of trying to make it in America with little more than hope. As a young man, he worked as a clerk at the U.S. consulate in Budapest and later in Trieste. Imagine that for a moment. Before rising to political fame, LaGuardia was sorting visas and helping immigrants navigate a world of paperwork and bureaucracy. And maybe that was the moment something clicked. Maybe in those lines of people waiting for a better life, he saw how deeply systems can shape the lives of ordinary people. It was a seed that would grow into a lifelong commitment to public service. Fiorello returned to the United States in the early 1900s, earned a law degree, and soon stepped into the rough-and-tumble world of New York politics. He wasn't tall, he wasn't wealthy, he wasn't part of the political machine, but he had something far more powerful. He was impossible to ignore. He spoke with the fire of a preacher, the humor of a street performer, and the conviction of a man who had seen too many people struggle alone. In 1916, LaGuardia won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, becoming one of the few Italian Americans in Congress. And if you're imagining a calm, quiet congressman politely waiting his turn to speak, forget it. LaGuardia was a thunderbolt. He fought child labor, demanded worker protections, and stood against discrimination with a sharpness that surprised even his colleagues. He was also one of the first congressmen to openly criticize prohibition, calling it a failure long before the rest of the government caught up. Then came World War I. LaGuardia enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Service and served as a pilot, flying missions in Italy. It's wild to imagine this short, fiery congressman squeezed into a military plane, dodging enemy fire. But that was LaGuardia. When something mattered, he stepped in himself. After the war, he served as president of the New York City Board of Aldermen from 1920 to 1921. But the real turning point came a decade later when New York City was drowning under the Great Depression. Crime soared. Homelessness exploded, and the once mighty metropolis looked like it was cracking down the middle. Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that had controlled the city for decades, had finally burned through its last drops of public trust. By 1933, New Yorkers were ready for someone different. Fiorello LaGuardia ran for mayor on a promise of honest government, modern infrastructure, and a city that worked for everyone, not just the politically connected. And he won. In fact, he really won, with a mandate so strong that even Tammany's power couldn't stop him. From the moment he entered office, LaGuardia unleashed a whirlwind of energy. He worked with President Franklin Roosevelt to secure federal funding for public works, turning New York into a laboratory of New Deal innovation. Under his leadership, the city saw the construction of airports, bridges, highways, schools, and public housing. LaGuardia Airport? Yes, named after him, because he was the guy who pushed for its creation and believed New York needed a world-class gateway to the skies. And while we're talking about airplanes, here's a fun detail. LaGuardia once refused to land in Newark, New Jersey because his ticket said New York. He demanded the pilot fly him to an airfield in Brooklyn instead. That moment of pure stubbornness helped spark the idea for a proper New York airport. But his legacy runs deeper than infrastructure. LaGuardia reorganized the police department, cracked down on corruption, and took on the mob and bootleggers with a level of political fearlessness rarely seen in city politics. He wasn't intimidated by mob bosses, crime syndicates, or even newspaper tycoons who tried to paint him as unhinged. If anything, he used their attacks as fuel. And then came one of the most iconic moments of his mayoralty, the 1945 newspaper strike. Without newspapers, how could New Yorkers get their daily comics? LaGuardia grabbed a copy of the comic strips, went on the radio, and read them aloud with all the dramatic flair of a Broadway actor. He voiced Little Orphan Annie, Dick Tracy, and every character in between. The man had no shame, and people adored him for it. For a moment, a city in turmoil shared a laugh together, all because their mayor knew how to lift a city's spirits. Yet, despite his humor, LaGuardia carried a deep seriousness when it came to justice. He passionately fought discrimination, defended immigrant communities, and pushed New York towards a more inclusive identity. He saw the city not as a machine, but as a living organism, pulsing with people from every background imaginable. He wanted each of them to feel protected. During World War II, LaGuardia coordinated civil defense efforts and prepared New York for potential attacks. He did everything from overseeing blackout drills to fighting inflation and rationing abuses. He was everywhere, all the time, bursting into rooms with that signature LaGuardia energy, part storm, part sunshine. By the time he left office in 1945, New Yorkers didn't just see him as a mayor. They saw him as the leader who dragged the city out of its darkest decade into a new era of progress and possibility. In 12 years, he had reshaped New York's identity, modern, ambitious, and unafraid. Fiorello H. LaGuardia passed away in 1947, just 2 years after leaving City Hall. But even today, you can still feel his imprint. In the airports, the bridges, the housing projects, the parks, and, more importantly, in the culture of a city that values boldness, diversity, and grit. LaGuardia wasn't tall, but his legacy towers. He was proof that leadership isn't about size, it's about heart, conviction, and the courage to shout louder than the chaos around you. And in a city that never sleeps, his voice still echoes. Small man, big city, even bigger impact.